One of the things it is great to be doing again is having weddings in church with more than 30 people present. And so it is that in the next 2 weekends, I'm going to be taking the first 2 weddings I've taken for a very long time indeed. Weddings are the focus of months of planning and perhaps years of dreaming. And since the pandemic, in many cases, years of waiting as well. Friends, families, parents, nowadays even wedding planners have an investment in the day, and they all have their ideas. And sometimes, though not in the case of the 2 couples I'm working with at the moment, but sometimes you need to ask people to check and hold back and ask the couple themselves, is this what you want? Matthew may be describing a scene like that in the gospel reading we've just heard with the sons of Zebedee. The 2 sons are not named in the passage, but we already know that they are John and today's saint, James. In a way, the question is about a seating plan, which is often a tricky issue at a wedding. In Mark's Gospel, the boys approach Jesus themselves with their request, but Matthew paints a different picture, the request coming from their mother, whose name we are never told. How does your imagination fill out the scene? Perhaps you picture 2 embarrassed teenagers saying, "Just leave it, Mum," as she hustles them to Jesus, and then squirming as she makes her "only the best for my boys" bid for them to be in places of honour, one at Jesus' right and one at his left, when he is in his glorious kingdom. Jesus answers her, "You don't know what you're asking." And then it seems turns to the 2 sons to check if this is what they really want. And he asks them, "Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink?" That is Jesus' way of referring to his death. If they are to be at his side in glory, they must first be at his side in humiliation. And even then, there's no guarantee. So, are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink? Yes, they reply. Or perhaps do you picture it the other way round? Perhaps the sons put their poor mother up to it, making this request. And perhaps they're full of bravado, no problem, when Jesus asks if they have got what it takes. Saint John Chrysostom, preaching on this passage about 1700 years ago, takes this second line. The request was theirs, he says of James and John, and being ashamed, they put forward their mother. The essentials, though, are clear. The request has consequences, or if there is such a word, prequences. The road to being with Jesus in his glory runs first through the valley of the shadow of death and being with him there. And in any case, Jesus himself does not issue VIP passes. Later in Matthew's Gospel, when Jesus is dying on the cross, there will be 2 people, one at his right and one at his left, but neither of them will be James or John. They will be 2 convicted criminals, again unnamed, just the next 2 people on the list for crucifixion that day in the barbaric bureaucracy of Roman imperial rule. This mother's sons will be nowhere to be seen. Back in our story, the other disciples get cross with James and John. Though I don't think it's because the other disciples are above questions of power and status, the false attractions of this world. Only a few verses earlier, they've been asking Jesus about who is the greatest. It seems, no, they're angry because they don't want these two to get ahead of the rest of them. Now, on that earlier occasion and on this occasion, Jesus has just warned the disciples that he is going to die. On both occasions, they show that they simply haven't taken in what he said, because they come back at him with questions about power and status. And on both occasions, Jesus takes the opportunity to do some staff training on leadership and what leadership looks like in his eyes. On the first occasion, he places in the middle of the disciples a small child. Now, a child of a young age in that society might suffer great neglect or worse, as many children do today. Even the word child in Greek is a neuter word, neither he nor she, but it. And Jesus says that that child, without power or status in their world, is the gold standard for the values in his kingdom. On the second occasion, which is our scene this morning, Jesus asks them to use their imaginations to picture the rulers of the pagan world. Perhaps the thrones, the high-end fabrics, the fanfares, the sort of thing they might soon be seeing in Jerusalem when they enter the city if the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, is passing by. It will not be like that with you, says Jesus. And again, he draws on a dark aspect of their society to make his point. Small children have no power or status, but nor do many adults, those who are servants, slaves. And, says Jesus, that is how it's going to be for me and for those who are with me, because he has come not to be served, but to serve. About 10 days ago, some of us on the clergy team here at the cathedral spent an afternoon of staff training. It was training on a vital subject. It was about safeguarding, and we did it online with two colleagues from the Church of England's headquarters in London. In all our minds were the stories, the appalling, shameful stories of abuse committed in churches. Crimes usually committed by people who are enjoying positions of power and status, and committed against children or adults who are vulnerable, who have little power or low status, or, to be honest, none of either. ICSA, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, has been highly critical of the Church of England. One thing its report has identified as a problem in our church is what it calls deference, a culture that allows people, perhaps as in Jesus' phrase, to lord it over others, because the essential characteristic of lording it over someone is that you are immune from challenge or accountability. You might say that certain churches appear to be especially vulnerable to this. If you look around the cathedral this morning, you look at who is wearing what, you might ask yourself, who is most likely to be lording it over whom in this place? But cultures of deference in churches are much more subtle than that. In preparing for that training day, we studied some stories of abuse in different churches, And these were churches that were likely to have quite egalitarian dress codes in services, though that did not stop them from being pretty authoritarian in the way that they were run. The aim of the training was to help us develop our thinking about what makes for healthy church cultures. A culture that helps a church to be better able to achieve its mission in the world, and also better at preventing harm and abuse from happening to others, and a church that can respond well to those who are victims or survivors of abuse. Well, a good way to mark this feast day of James might be to remember that tin-eared question in the gospel reading about status, and to let that prompt us to ask, what is it that makes for a culture that's rather closer to the one Jesus has in mind? For instance, how do we encourage respect without deference? John Chrysostom has some wisdom here in his ancient sermon on this passage. He says the story is all about pride and humility. Pride he describes as the root, source, and mother of sin, and humility as the mother, root, nurse, foundation, and centre of all other virtues. These things, of course, reach far beyond the life of the church. And as the gospel reading encourages us to look at the rulers in the world, let's consider the cascade of problems that our planet is facing, and then see where we would place the different rulers and regimes in the nations of the world on that spectrum between pride and humility. But back to the saint of the day. I think it is a little bit harsh on James to hold him up as an example of how not to be and then leave it there. James's story is also an encouragement not to despair when we get things wrong, as I do and probably as you do too. Because despite his false start as a disciple of Jesus, James was indeed to follow Jesus' path. 11 terse words in our first reading from the Acts of the Apostles tell us how, in those very first days of the church, King Herod moved against some who belonged to the church. He had Jesus, the brother of John, killed with the sword. So in the end, James did drink the cup that his master drank. He shared his humiliation, as now he shares his glory, as you and I are invited to do.